The bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Perth.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, there is little doubt that the new university fee and loan repayment structures will see debt levels for students doubling or trebling, putting the quest for higher education out of the reach for many. Now, I have no doubt that this is no great worry to the Prime Minister and to Minister Pyne, who at their heart believe that educational is a positional good, and that just as when you make a lot of money, you get to buy the Maserati or the Alpha, so too education and elite education should be the preserve of those who fundamentally who have had the opportunity to make make do well financially. They're not motivated, and I think this has been recently described by Maxine McHugh in her new book on education as the view that education is a positional good, a view embraced by Minister Pyne. This is not, of course, an egalitarian spirit, but indeed, well, these aren't people that are motivated fundamentally by the quest for equality of opportunity, but rather they are hankering after the hierarchies of the old world. So I just want to go on any analysis, whether we're talking about from the group of 8, the elite universities, to the National Tertiary Education Union. There is agreement that fees will need to go up by around 30% just to make up for the cuts that have been made in this budget to the universities, particularly the massive per capita cuts to the Commonwealth-supported places. So the per capita payment that is made currently to each student is going to be significantly cut. For some degrees, that figure, again, just the increase that will be necessary to cover the cut in the Commonwealth-supported place per capita payment, in some cases that figure is going to be closer to 60%. So just look at some of these areas. Engineering, an area where we should be encouraging our young people. We've seen the Commonwealth contribution cut by 28%, increasing student fees by 54%. In nursing, an area where we are importing vast numbers of people because we haven't got enough nurses, what we're seeing, the Commonwealth is cutting their contribution by 8.5% per annum and increasing student fees by 18.5%. And bizarrely, in agriculture, where they're going to a great extent to try to encourage people into agriculture, because it is recognised that there is a chronic shortage of the professionals and in this area, and that is hampering the opportunity of the agricultural sector to seize the opportunities that are being presented by emerging new markets. But in agriculture, we're seeing the fees being cut, the contribution of the Commonwealth being cut by 15% and increasing student fees by 37%, while at the same time we're acknowledging we need to attract more people into this sector because it has traditionally not been a well-paid sector. I see, just interestingly, in my area, performing arts, in my electorate we have arguably the best performing arts academy in Australia, and we see cuts there being made of 23% and increasing student fees by 45%. And I think this is going to be something, the visual and performing arts will increasingly become something that can only be engaged in by people who have wealthy parents. So, of course, to cover these cuts in funding, so we've got every student is going to now receive, the university will receive less from them. To cover those, we have fee deregulation. Now, it's interesting, the Minister makes much of the support for fee deregulation from the group of 8 universities. And it is true that in the current funding environment, with $6 billion worth of cuts to higher education, there are universities believe that they need more, they need to be able to charge more to build the reputation of their universities. But of course we know that this way of doing it through deregulation will come at the expense of the rest of the sector and at the expense of that principle of merit-based access. And this is a betrayal of that very notion which underpins what it is to be Australian, the notion that your ability and your effort and not your birth determines your ability to succeed. And not everyone from the G8 is blind to this. If I can quote Professor Kwong Lee Dow, the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, he says most universities will raise fees, at least to offset their loss of income from government subsidies. Many will go further to boost the total level of income they receive to above 2014 levels. Either way, higher education loan program debts will abandon. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney, Professor Michael Spence, warned that fee deregulation risked pricing the middle-class families out of tertiary education. He said, "It is ordinary Australians that I think aren't getting enough of a Guernsey in this conversation." But not even the G8, who are supporting deregulation, but not even the G8 support the restructuring of the loan repayment system. And let me quote a few here. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, Warren Beddington, says aspects of the change are unworkable and unduly harsh. The compounding interest here means that we might deliver debts to students of $70,000, $80,000, $100,000, and no one here wanted that. Likewise, the University of Queensland's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Peter Hodge, revealing that the budget would cost his university at least $60 million and hurt students, said, "I am generally concerned about the changes to loan repayments. I do think it was very unexpected, and I think it is one of those things that really make the cuts to government funding for students sting more than we had anticipated." So not even his friends in the group of 8 will come out and support this massively unfair way in which the loan repayment system has been restructured. Now let's talk about this. There's 3 prongs to this restructuring. First is the reduction in the repayment threshold, no longer now $53,000, reduced down to $50,000. Secondly, and more importantly, is the move from a CPI indexation to a bond rate indexation, and this is capped at 6%, but the modelling shows that probably the most likely outcome over the long term is around 5%. And then the third prong is the introduction of the compounding interest. So if we look at those 3 brought together, and the impact of higher fees and then the restructure, we see that total interest obligations could increase between 300% and 700%, and we could see overall debt levels double. Universities Australia have modelled various scenarios that compare existing HECS obligations with those which will be experienced from students from next year on. So just taking a medium fee scenario, the interest payment, we take a nurse. We're taking a pretty standard sort of scenario here. So under the current regime, with the CPI funding and current fee levels, a graduate nurse would expect to be paying over the course of her loan less than $4,000 on interest payment. Now, under this new regime, and taking a pretty modest scenario of a nurse that continues to work full-time until such time that her HECS debt has been completed, she will be paying now in interest alone between $14,000 and $26,000, depending on the actual bond rate. So even with a bond rate of 4%, that is a 300% increase just on the interest charges. And that if a graduate nurse, and if, of course, we see this compounding, particularly poorly for women, who in most instances will take time out to have a family. And in that same case, if that same nurse works for 6 years full-time and then goes on to part-time work, that increase in the interest rate will be 400%, and it will go up to $20,000. So the interest will go from less than $4,000 to $20,000, or indeed a bond rate of 5% will go to around $30,000. So again, the interest charge will be more than doubling the debt. Likewise with engineering graduates, they will see an engineering graduate that is lucky enough to get a job will see their interest charges go from around $9,000 to between $37,000 and $78,000, and that is on, as I say, that is on a modest fee trajectory. And we already see banks and lending institutions are beginning to ask applicants for housing loans about their HECS debt, which indicates that students are going to have to really be considering very seriously the amount of debt that they are accruing. And it is not well known and not as well known as the impact that this is going to have on new students is in fact the impact of the elevated and compounding interest rate that will apply retrospectively to over 1 million Australians, and indeed to nearly 110,000 West Australians with massive HECS debts, be they current or former students. So that this is not just going to apply to students now, that going into the future from next year on, this implies in fact to, in Western Australia, over 110,000 West Australians who entered into their degrees thinking and signing up to a regime of a CPI indexation. About half of those have debts, about half of those West Australians have debts of $30,000 or more. Where I had a letter from a young West Australian, Georgina Kerr, a 32-year-old in my electorate. She has been out of the workforce for 5 years, raising a family, now going back in, has short-term contracts and indeed an income level just above the repayment threshold. She is now facing a vast escalation of her liabilities for reasons that were not known because of this change of regime, a regime that she had no reason to expect would happen. It's a travesty, as the consumer law specialist Jeannie Marie Patterson said. It's akin to banks forcing mortgagees onto a flexible interest rate. So here we have 110,000 West Australians, over 1 million West Australians, who suddenly have seen not just the goalpost shifted, but in many cases just cut from under them. That there has been this profound change in the way of the repayment regime that is applying retrospectively. And of course we know Minister Pyne doesn't think that's right. He told the Parliament in 2010 it is a fundamental principle of law and regulation that if someone relies on the laws and regulations at the time, they should be able to rely on those laws into the future. They should not have the goalpost changed on them in the middle of that reliance. I just want to make a brief reference to the provision, the move away from the provision just to publicly owned or not-for-profit institutions to the provision of for-profit private providers. And Professor Greg Craven had said today, everyone knows that this gravy train will end up pulling into the Ma and Pa Kettle Business Academy, and that non-universities that have nothing like the funding requirements of Australia's national intellectual powerhouses. And he calls upon the government to defer it, ditch it, or discombobulate it, and take the opportunity to reduce the cuts where they matter. So we are taking money out of established Australian universities to fund the Ma and Pa Kettle Business Academy. How on earth can we justify that as part of making our higher education system stronger and more capable? And we do need to be really focused on this. This is going to have, what we are doing is going to have profound impact on the future of higher education in Australia, on the future of our community. And can we at least call upon the Minister for Education to read the words today of Professor Craven, Vice-Chancellor Craven, and ditch the funding to these not-for-profit organisations. Ditch the funding to these for-profit organisations who will be fundamentally driven by preserving shareholder value, who will not be driven by furthering the interests of Australia and ensuring that we have a highly educated population.
I thank